Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I'm going to show you how the legal basis behind climate alarmism is based on politics and not science. The EPA CO2 Endangerment Finding is the document which gives climate alarmists the ability to shut down our fossil fuel infrastructure. Without this document, alarmists have no legal basis to do anything. The endangerment finding was created by the EPA during President Obama's first year in office. And as I'm going to show you in the next few minutes, it has no scientific basis. This graph was created from data downloaded from Our World in Data, a website run by Oxford University. On the y-axis is global death rates from natural disasters per 100,000 people, and on the x-axis is atmospheric CO2 increasing from left to right. Over the past century, atmospheric CO2 has increased from about 300 parts per million to 400 parts per million. And during that time, death rates from natural disasters has plummeted to close to zero. Reality is the exact opposite of the belief system behind the CO2 endangerment finding. Now let's look at global life expectancy. Life expectancy is more than doubled as CO2 has increased from 300 parts per million to over 400 parts per million. When atmospheric CO2 was 300 parts per million, life expectancy around the world was less than 40 years. But now it's over 70 years. Once again, reality is the exact opposite of the belief system behind the CO2 endangerment finding. Now let's look at crop yields. As CO2 has increased from 300 parts per million to 400 parts per million, corn productivity in the U.S. has increased by 500%. This shouldn't surprise anyone. Commercial greenhouse operators pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere of their greenhouse to make the plants grow faster. A few years ago, NASA did a study showing that Earth has gotten much greener over the last 35 years, largely due to rising levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Green plants love and need carbon dioxide. Most people learn this in elementary school. Plant growth requires sunlight, carbon dioxide, water, and chlorophyll, which makes the green color in leaves. These combine to produce plant growth and oxygen. The reason we have oxygen in our atmosphere in abundance is because we have plants, and the reason we have plants is because we have carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. Classifying one of the basic requirements of life as a pollutant is simply obscene. The greatest explosion of life on Earth occurred 540 million years ago during the Cambrian era, when atmospheric CO2 was right at its peak of about 7,000 parts per million. That's almost 20 times as much carbon dioxide as in the atmosphere now. Life thrived on Earth during times when atmospheric CO2 was much higher than it is at present. People who claim that increasing levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide threaten life with extinction have absolutely no clue what they're talking about. The geological history of the Earth tells us the exact opposite. So we've seen that higher levels of CO2 are very safe and productive. Now let's look at lower levels of CO2. Yesterday in my video I discussed the year 1878, which brought the worst drought and famine in history. Carbon dioxide levels were below 300 parts per million at the time. This article is from February 2, 1878 from the Australasian newspaper. The month of January 1878 will be long remembered by the farming community as a period of heat and drought scarcely ever known or experienced in this colony before. On Thursday the 10th last, the heat was most intense, the thermometer registering 123 degrees in the shade and 158 degrees in the sun. The weather still continues extremely hot and dry. The absence of rain is causing great anxiety among all classes of the community. Sheep and cattle are almost famishing for want of feed and water. Meanwhile, in the United States, there was no winter in Minnesota that year. Minneapolis Tribune, March 19, 1878, a wonderful winter. Observations on the weather have been kept at Fort Snelling since 1819. There is nothing in the memory of the living or the records of the dead that give us such a winter and spring as we have passed in the last 4 or 5 months. Indeed, we've had no winter weather in Minnesota. It's hard to imagine no winter in Minnesota, particularly after last winter's record cold. Last winter, Illinois set their all-time cold record of minus 39 degrees. 50 million people died in the record heat and drought during 1878. Scientists explained the unprecedented extreme weather of 1878 as being due to ocean circulation patterns. This tells us two things. One is that expecting that lower levels of CO2 will prevent extreme weather is nonsense. And two, CO2 does not control extreme weather. So once again, the basis of the CO2 endangerment finding is complete nonsense. Last week, the United Nations transferred a child on a multi-million-dollar yacht from Sweden to speak at the United Nations headquarters. The plan was for her to tell the world that her childhood had been stolen by rising levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. The lines on her script read, "You have stolen my dreams." 500,000 people died in Brazil in 1878 during the low CO2 drought and famine. Most of these were children. I'm sure that they would have been happy to trade places with the charmed life of Greta Thunberg. Let's go back now to the CO2 endangerment finding. It is based on two key lines of evidence. One is the global temperature record, and the other is output of climate models. Let's see what climate expert Dr. Nakamura has to say about that. Dr. Nakamura received a Doctorate of Science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and for nearly 25 years specialized in abnormal weather and climate change at prestigious institutions which included MIT, Georgia Tech, NASA, JPL, Caltech, Jamstech, and Duke University. In his book, The Global Warming Hypothesis is Unproven, Dr. Nakamura explains why the data foundation underpinning global warming science is untrustworthy and cannot be relied on. Global mean temperatures before 1980 are based on untrustworthy data, writes Nakamura. Before full planet surface observation by satellite began in 1980, only a small part of the Earth had been observed for temperatures with only a certain amount of accuracy and frequency. Across the globe, only North America and Western Europe have trustworthy temperature data going back to the 19th century. From 1990 to 2014, Nakamura worked on cloud dynamics and forces mixing atmospheric and ocean flows on medium to planetary scales. He's published more than 20 climate papers on fluid dynamics. Today's global warming science is akin to an upside-down pyramid which is built on the work of a few climate modelers who claim to have demonstrated human-derived CO2 emissions as the cause of recently rising temperatures, and have then simply projected that warming forward. Every climate researcher thereafter has taken the results of these original models as a given, and we're even at the stage now where merely testing their validity is regarded as heresy. Some computer models are extremely valuable, and others are completely useless. I'm going to talk now a little bit about my modeling experience, and then explain why it's important. I've worked with and developed computer models for most of the last 40 years. The first modeling I did was modeling heat flow around geothermal energy sources in New Mexico at Los Alamos National Laboratories. Then I did modeling at Los Alamos Labs of fracturing of oil shales. The most fun modeling I did at Los Alamos, though, wasn't computer models. It was actual physical models of volcanoes where we got to blow things up at a high explosives testing facility. I've got lots of good stories to tell about that. My next modeling job was modeling groundwater flow around the Department of Energy's nuclear waste site in southeastern New Mexico. I've done software development on climate and weather models for the National Center for Atmospheric Research here in Boulder, Colorado. I was hired by NCAR to find ways to make their climate models run faster, so I know quite a bit about how they work. I did the same thing for NCAR's weather models, and I also ported their weather models over from Linux to Windows. The point being that I'm talking about a field which I'm somewhat familiar with. I worked for many years as a microprocessor designer for companies like Intel, Motorola, IBM, Apple, ST Microelectronics, Cyrex, National Semiconductor, and even founded a microprocessor startup with a few colleagues. There's a pretty high probability that I helped design the brain of your computer and your game console. My specialty was writing computer models to test performance and to flesh out errors in the designs. I was given this award by IBM, Apple, and Motorola. The PowerPC 604 RISC microprocessor, made functional by Tony Debug God Heller. But I couldn't have done this without computer models, couldn't even have come close. I also helped design the world's first 2 billion transistor microprocessor at Intel. Modern electronics could not be designed without computer models. But not all models are equal. You can't model something unless you can explain it. Climate models cannot explain the extreme heat, drought, and famine of 1878. They can't even come close. Climate models can't explain the heat wave of 1896, 1901, 1911, 1913, 1916, 1918, 1921, 1927, 1930, 1931, 1934, 1936, 1954, 1980, or any others. Climate models are academic toys which can't explain the past and certainly can't predict the future. Imagine you wrote a computer model based on the idea that Liverpool's football club was going to win all of their matches by 1 or 2 goals. And then you used the output of that model to prove that Liverpool was going to win all of their matches by 1 or 2 goals in the future. Well, obviously that's nonsense. It's garbage in, garbage out. The model simply reflects the bias of the person who wrote it. And that's how climate models work. They're based around the idea that CO2 controls the climate. The only thing which the output of a climate model proves is the inherent biases of the person who wrote the climate model. There's no reason to believe that the output of a climate model will have any predictive skill of future climate. This is completely different from the kind of models we used in developing microprocessors, which were 100% accurate. So the two things which the CO2 endangerment finding is primarily based on are both fraudulent. One is the global temperature record, which, as Dr. Nakamura explained, is completely unreliable, and the other is climate models, which have no useful predictive skill. And the CO2 endangerment finding is being used by climate alarmists to shut down the reliable energy supply in the United States. Most people just take for granted the idea that when they go to the gas station, there'll be gas there. When they turn on the light switch, there'll be light. When they turn on the heat, there'll be heat. When they turn on the air conditioning, there'll be air conditioning. When they go to the airport, the planes will have fuel to fly. We can't imagine how difficult our world would be without that. What if truck drivers couldn't get fuel to bring food to the stores? How would that affect us? We also take breathing for granted, but if you've ever had your windpipe choked off by food, you find out that your whole world can collapse in a matter of seconds. The CO2 endangerment finding and its planned abuse by people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Cortez is incredibly dangerous to all of us. The abuse of this document by clueless climate alarmists has the ability to end civilization as we know it. Climate alarmists maintain this simple-minded idea that we can replace our massive infrastructure based on fossil fuels with things like windmills and electric cars. I'm an electrical engineer, and these people have no idea what they're talking about. The scale of this undertaking is absolutely enormous. And there are massive technical hurdles which nobody has any clue how to deal with at this point in time. Things like the fact that the sun doesn't shine at night and doesn't shine much in the winter or on cloudy days. The wind doesn't blow all the time. Manufacturing electric cars carries tremendous environmental costs, and they have very short range. Could you imagine if every car on the interstate highway had to stop every hour or two and spend an hour or two recharging? The logistics would be completely unworkable. Our interstate highway commercial transport system would be shut down. Our civilization depends on a reliable supply of very large amounts of high energy density liquid fuels. Our civilization can't survive without that any more than our bodies can survive without oxygen. This is not to say that we can't cut way back on our wastage of fossil fuels. We're terrible about that. We need to become much more efficient, cleaner, and preserve fossil fuels for future generations. But simply shutting down the fossil fuel supply would be suicide. George Orwell said, "So much of left-wing thought is a kind of playing with fire by people who don't even know that fire is hot." Carbon dioxide is not dangerous, but having an inadequate supply of energy would be extremely dangerous. We need to get this political document from the Obama administration shut down and removed as a threat to our society. It has no legitimate basis in science and needs to be reversed. Speak to your representatives in Washington and demand that the EPA endangerment finding is revisited and reversed. And visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.